Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where and when you're watching this. I hope as you see this that you and yours are safe and as comfortable as you can be under our current circumstances. This is Lesson 21, War in the Air, and I've already seen, of course, Garrett's and Adam's videos, so I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys a little bit about the two books that are left. But before we do that, and just so you know, I'm going through the slides just in case you want to follow along. First up are the course administration stuff. The only thing new there is I believe, fingers crossed, that I've got this assignment thing figured out on Blackboard. So when you're ready to upload your second annotated bibliography, please do that to Blackboard rather than emailing it to me. If you've already emailed it to me, that's okay, but I'm going to ask you to go back and upload it to Blackboard as well. I'm going to try this now for grading, and I think it's going to work better than me trying to print, grade, and scan and send back. That was working pretty well when I had access to Campus. It's not working so well now that Campus is closed, so I'm going to try this Blackboard grading thing. So go ahead and upload, please. And I also understand it took me a while to get to annotated bibliography number 1 back, and I still haven't had a chance to scan and return all those to you yet. So if you need to delay your second annotated bibliography because you're waiting for feedback, that's okay. If you have questions, please email me and I will answer them. Whether or not I can get scanned back to you, I don't know exactly when that's going to happen. So I will get on that. Everything else is pretty much as is, but as always, ask questions if you've got them. Okay. Oh, the job front. Yeah, probably not a great time to be on the job market. Everything is rather disrupted, but at the same time, the skills you're gaining and the experience you're gaining and the abilities you have are going to land you a job one of these days. Once we figure out what post-COVID life in America and around the world is going to be like. But be thinking about this sort of thing. This project manager / fundraiser at Eckley's Miners Village Associates in Weatherly, Pennsylvania. I chose this one because fundraising is incredibly important to any nonprofit organization. And if you are going to be working in museums or libraries or archives, unless you're working for a government agency, fundraising is probably going to become part of your life. And it's maybe not our favorite thing to do. If that was our favorite thing to do, maybe we'd be over in business. But it is an important part of keeping what we do going. So if you can pick up some skills in that regard, not a bad thing. All right. Oh, another job. Just wanted to point out I am, in honor of today's lesson, wearing my B-17 t-shirt. There we go. And I wanted to let you know that it is a souvenir of the Mighty 8th Air Force Heritage Museum in Savannah, Georgia, which I visited some years back. Just goes to show that the things we're studying, the things we're talking about, there's an interest out there. There are jobs to be had. We're just going to have to brace ourselves to figure out what's going on for a little bit. All right, the writing tip of the day. This is a fairly straightforward one, but it's one that crops up fairly frequently in student writing, and the difference between everyday and everyday. Everybody got that? Well, if you look at the slide, you do, because everyday is a single word, and it is an adjective, always used before a noun. So everyday activities, everyday reading, those sorts of things. Whereas everyday, 2 words, refers to each day, something that happens every day. Seems straightforward enough, right? Right. All right, so moving on to the topic assignments. Today is War in the Air with Adam and Garrett. Next Thursday, Thursday will be Gabby and Trevor about America Transformed, looking at the home front issues. And because of my surgery tomorrow, I don't know when I'm going to be capable of recording a video for my add-on. Hopefully maybe Saturday is a realistic goal on that one. But I will look forward to Gabby and Trevor. I'll upload those as soon as I can, Friday or Saturday, depending on how things go. I don't expect to be in really happy times for a few days after tomorrow. So, we'll look forward to that. And then we'll just carry on through the rest of the semester. Hope your research is going well too. If you've got questions, ask. All right, well, so moving on to the books. Um, Thank you to Garrett for Red Phoenix Rising and Strategy for Defeat. Thank you to Adam for Bomber Command and Winged Victory. When I put this lesson together, when I was selecting, and this was a tough one, selecting books. Man, did I have to drop a lot of ones, a lot of books I really wanted to use because, well, I'm an Air Force veteran, so I had a lot of books on my list about air warfare, but I had to trim it back a little bit. And I tried to take as wide a view as we could on this. The 4 books that Adam and Garrett looked at collectively all take a national view. So you have Red Phoenix Rising, which is about the Soviet Air Force, the VVS. You have Max Hastings' Bomber Command, about the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command. You have Strategy for Defeat, the Luftwaffe. Murray's book is about the German Air Force, and Winged Victory is about the American Air Forces in World War II. So the 2 books we have left take slightly different tacks. And I think I'm going to start with Overlord by, whoops, got some glare there, by Thomas Alexander Hughes. Overlord, General Pete Quesada and the Triumph of Tactical Air Power in World War II. Now, the historiography of air power is very much conditioned by the politics involved, meaning in World War II, as readers of Winged Victory will know, the United States Army Air Forces were part of the U.S. Army. They were not an independent branch the way the Air Force is today. And most of the leaders, the vast majority of the leaders of the Air Forces, meaning still part of the Army, very much wanted the Air Force to be an independent service after the war. And they felt the best way to do that was to emphasize the important and indeed decisive contributions made by air power during the war. And this meant the tasks that air power was doing by themselves, not in support of the ground forces, i.e. the strategic bombing campaigns. Attacking enemy factories in the homeland. So the B-17s and B-24s flying over Europe and the B-29s flying over Japan to strike the enemy homeland and to hopefully, didn't happen that way except maybe in the case of Japan, to win the war without ground forces having to take on the major role. Because that role, strategic bombing, was so important to the post-war position of the Air Forces, if the U.S. Air Force would become an independent service or not, many of the other missions carried out by air power didn't get as much attention or press from the senior leadership. And this is what Hughes is really digging into. He's specifically talking about tactical air power. And in military terms, strategic means things like striking the enemy homeland, striking the means of production to prevent, sorry, I'm getting a little weird thing here, computer. Stop that. Oh, crud, now I've lost myself. There I am. Hi. Yes, online teaching. It's a whole new frontier. Anyway, tactical, on the other hand, refers to what happens when you're actually in contact with the enemy. And in aviation terms, tactical air power is associated with supporting troops on the ground. And this is the topic of Overlord. Pete Quesada was an American Air Forces, i.e. part of the Army, general in World War II, and he pushed the idea of tactical air power. He argued that one of the most important things, not the only important thing, but one of the most important things air power could do was indeed support the troops on the ground. But in order to do that, you had to develop specific techniques. The same things that you did when you were bombing a factory from 30,000 feet did not work when you were trying to attack a tank or a bunker that was holding up the advance of Allied ground forces. So what Hughes does is use Pete Quesada's life as a template for understanding the rise of tactical air power, the importance of tactical air power, and its role in World War II for the Allies. Excuse me, water break. go. So what you have methodologically is sort of an odd mix, a partial biography of Quesada and also an analysis of tactical air power. And it seems odd, but it actually works really well. By giving us the figure of Quesada to kind of hang our hats on, it makes it kind of easier to track these various developments by looking at his specific role in them. And ultimately, Hughes concludes that Quesada became a master of this form of air power, that his 9th Air Force, the 8th Air Force was the heavy bombers, but his 9th Air Force, which was in charge of tactical operations, turned tactical aviation into a truly incredible weapon. Very close coordination between ground troops and air power, to the point where, for example, of course, the famous George Patton, when he broke out of Normandy and struck off across France, he didn't bother securing his southern flank because he said, I don't need to, because airplanes are up there taking care of that. If the Germans try to mass an attack on my flank, not only will I know about it, the aviation will break it up before it comes close. So that kind of close cooperation between ground and air forces was really perfected by the end of the war by Quesada and some of his contemporaries. But then Hughes goes on to tell us, with the end of World War II, the Army Air Forces, well on their way towards independence as the United States Air Force, wanted to ignore those lessons and those skills because air power in support of the Army is not an independent mission that justifies an independent Air Force. As a result, a lot of the tactical lessons that Quesada learned and taught were lost as the U.S. Air Force went all in on strategic bombing and bigger and faster bombers year after year. Quesada himself gave up and retired early because he didn't see a space in the new Air Force really for himself or for his ideas. So comparing that kind of to the rest of the works we're looking at, what we're really looking at here is kind of a form of institutional history, if you will. Why does the Air Force remember the things it remembers, forgets the things it forgets, and why did somebody like Quesada sort of have to struggle to establish tactical air power when it seems kind of obvious that this is an important thing? And the answer is, well, because it didn't politically suit the leadership to emphasize tactical air power. On general readability, Hughes he's a fine writer. It's a very good book, very enjoyable. I actually used this one as part of a summer course I taught on air power history, sort of a collection of independent studies, and it was one of the books, and it got fairly good marks from the students as readable, and I've enjoyed it certainly. The other one I'm going to shift to now is Mark Wells' Courage in Air Warfare, the Allied Aircrew Experience in World War II. And again, this one, unlike the 4 books that Garrett and Adam looked at, does not take a national approach to air power history, but rather a comparative approach. To tell you a little bit about this book, and this one's kind of a little more personal to me because I count Mark Wells as a friend and mentor of many years. I actually first encountered this book. I read Courage in Air Warfare while I was flying from Grand Forks, North Dakota to Colorado Springs to interview as a potential future instructor at the Air Force Academy. And it was up on the history department's webpage that Mark Wells' new book, Courage in Air Warfare, had just won a major award as the best military history book of the year. And not being dumb, I figured it might not be a bad idea to read it, so I was reading it on the flight into Colorado Springs. And it was then Colonel, later General Wells, who ultimately made the decision to hire me. Well, he wasn't the department head at the time, but he made the final recommendation that got me in the door to Colonel Riddell, who was the department chair, and got me the job. And then when General Riddell retired, Colonel Wells was the department chair for many years, pretty much almost up to the point where I retired. And so he was a mentor of many years' good standing and a good human being. It's also a good book. And here's where it departs from sort of this national history, in that it takes a comparative approach, looking at both the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, so Max Hastings' book, and the U.S. 8th Air Force, so a little shades of Perret's Winged Victory, and looking at their what he calls the Allied air crew experience. So what he is looking at is what it was actually like to fly in these big bombers to Germany through the Royal Air Force by night, through the U.S. Army Air Forces by day, and what that did to a person and what that did to the air crew members. Um, there's a lot of rough stuff in there. Something like 50% of the air crews involved in the strategic bombing campaign were killed. And that's a remarkable number. The 8th Air Force lost more men in World War II than the United States Marine Corps did. And the losses are heavy. A lot of people look at the air war and say it's not as challenging in many ways as the ground war, and there's some truth to that. Because if we look at books like When the Odds Were Even, or Atkinson, those sorts of books, the experiences of the infantry in combat are just horrific, and they don't end. Just because you aren't actively fighting doesn't mean you're in comfortable quarters. You're probably still in your foxhole, you're still in a trench, you're still in a bombed out building that you're using for shelter. And there's very, very rare opportunities for true relaxation behind the lines. Whereas the air crews would fly into combat, yes, but at the end of their mission, presuming they survived, they would be home not home, but they would be back at their home bases, sleeping in cots in barracks, sometimes tents, but mainly barracks, with the opportunity to maybe drive into town, visit the pub, to date, to drink, to sightsee in between missions. But one of the things Wells points out is that this didn't necessarily make things easier. And in some ways, it made it more psychologically stressful. The incredible psychological distance between the mission and the home front, or the mission and the base, was an additional source of stress. Again, there's sort of an assumption, hey, at least you're not in mud, you must be fairly comfortable. But flying airplanes thousands of feet high, before pressurized cockpits and pressurized cabins, meant things like electrically heated gloves and very thick padded clothes to deal with temperatures that were tens of degrees below zero Fahrenheit. If you touched metal with bare skin, it would rip off. If you needed to be on oxygen continually, if the oxygen failed, you would pass out very quickly. If an airplane was hit and crew members were injured or even killed, the injured or dead crew members would have to ride back, if you will, all the way to base. Sometimes if they were injured, with their fellow aircrew trying to perform emergency medical treatment, then trying to land a damaged aircraft. In short, there's a lot of stress. This is incredibly stressful stuff. And I'm not trying to say this is somehow worse than being on the ground. I'm just saying it's terrible in its own way. And because it's terrible, it causes psychological stress. And then one of the things that Wells really digs into is how to account for that. He starts his story with the idea of aircrew selection and training. How do you choose the people who are going to fly airplanes? And we're kind of used to the idea that pilots need to have good vision and good reflexes and those sorts of things. But specifically, Wells is looking at how did the Americans and the British differ in their efforts to find men who could handle this unique sort of stress, these alternating periods of utter safety and complete terror. Well, he talks about how the Royal Air Force and the American Air Forces adopted very different strategies. The Americans went all in on psychology and tried to develop a whole battery and bevy of tests to figure out what it would take to fly in combat and to choose the men who were going to be most successful at doing that. The British tended to be more traditional and rely on sort of the stiff upper lip, and to make sure to basically try to draw a very large pool of men into potential training, and then use the judgment of senior officers or veterans to try to pick out the people who would do the best. He doesn't discern any actual difference in the results between the two groups, that both managed to produce a substantial number of men to serve on air crews who were capable of withstanding the stress. But at the same time, both the Royal Air Force and the American Air Forces suffered tremendous numbers of psychological casualties, what we would now refer to as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder cases. They came up with differing ways to deal with, but mostly it seemed to involve arrest. There were rest homes for air crew throughout Britain, and simply taking the person off the line for a while seemed to be the best way to give them a chance to recover. Doctors also used heavily medicated sleep as a way of recovering from exhaustion. They would literally put people to sleep for a couple of days using medication to keep them asleep. So it's a good book to read. There are some fairly grisly passages when Wells is establishing that flying combat in World War II over Europe was not easy or fun. He gives you some tales that will probably stick with you for a while. They're fairly uncomfortable in their own way. But it's a well laid out book. It's a well organized book. Oh, by the way, you'll note that one of the people who was rejected for nervousness by the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army Air Force's psychological testing was Maurice L. Wells. No coincidence there, the author's father. Just noted that as I was flipping through the pictures. But he's really done an incredible job of putting together a highly readable book based mainly on primary documents from the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force, and a lot of interviews. Okay, a lot of interviews. Okay, so there's some fairly important stuff in here, and well worth taking a look at. Again, what I was trying to do with this is to get us to look at the war in the air in a variety of ways. The most obvious way, if you will, is the national way. Okay, here's the German Air Force. Let's talk about it. But there's other ways to do that. The comparative approach, or looking at a type of air warfare as opposed to a national version thereof. And these all work. Once again, this was a tough one, trimming things down to just 6 books, but we made it through. All right, that's about all I have on my end, other than to say, please follow the recommendations of our public health experts and our medical practitioners. Let them know, or excuse me, listen to them, not let them know, but listen to them and follow the guidelines. We will get through this. Things will get better. We're just going to have to be a little bit patient. And in the meantime, read a good book. You've got some good choices. All right. I will talk to you again when I've healed up. Bye.